the most conspicuous were Maximilla and Priscilla, or, as she is sometimes called, Prisca. These two constantly appear as his companions and as sharing in his spiritual gifts. Of the other women whose utterances were received as divine revelation, the only names that have come down to us are those of the martyrs Perpetua and Felicitas. The Montanists maintained, as earlier teachers had done, the perpetuity and necessity of the gifts of prophecy and vision. They received the whole of the Christian Scriptures. There was no heresy in their views with regard to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They held very earnest and very precise opinions as to the speedy coming of the Lord, and are said to have expected the descent of the New Jerusalem at a village in Phrygia, Pepusa, whence they are not unfrequently called Peputiani. Strangely enough, while insisting on the ever-present guidance of the Holy Spirit, they laid down precepts on permitted food and permitted acts which approached Judaic legalism. Their fasts were more numerous and more severe than those observed by the Church in general. Marriage was permitted, though the married were clearly placed on a lower level than the unmarried, and probably remained in the ranks of the catechumens. Second marriages were utterly condemned, as indeed they had often been condemned beforetime in the Church. With regard to sin after baptism, the Spirit declared through the new prophets, "The Church has power to remit sin, but I will not do it lest others offend." Martyrdom was by no means to be avoided by flight, but it was meritorious only if endured in faith and out of pure submission to God's will. The one visible Church of Christ included all who had been duly baptized, yet many of its members were merely physical or natural men. The spiritual or pneumatic were those alone who accepted the higher teaching of the Spirit by the mouth of His prophets, and each one of these was endued with the spiritual priesthood. Some peculiar rights were attributed to them. That women prophesied in the churches is admitted on all hands, but there is no reason to believe that this prophesying took place during divine service, or that women took any share in celebrating the mysteries. The unmarried women were closely veiled in the churches. It is not wholly improbable that the Montanists performed vicarious baptism on behalf of those who had died unbaptized. Such deaths were likely to be frequent in a society which detained the majority of its members in a long catechumenate. It is said that they used cheese in the Eucharist, but this may probably have been as an offering, rather than as a part of the actual Eucharistic celebration. That some disorder took place in their assemblies is probable enough. There have perhaps never been assemblies of ecstatics and visionaries which have not fallen into occasional improprieties, but it is impossible to accept as true the charges of child murder and of horrible food given in their secret rites, charges precisely similar to those of the heathen against the whole body of Christians, which were circulated in the later age. It is impossible to believe that Tertullian and Perpetua belonged to society capable of horrible crime in its secret assemblies. Teaching such as that of the Montanists naturally spread rapidly among the excitable people of Phrygia. The Church in that region was alarmed. Councils of the faithful were held, in which their tenets were condemned and themselves excommunicated. Tidings of the proceedings in Asia soon reached the Asiatic colony in southern Gaul, and the confessors yet in bonds, under stress of persecution, brought letters in the interests of peace, both to the brethren in Asia and Phrygia, and to Eleuthерus, bishop of Rome. One bishop of Rome, either Eleuthерus or Victor, acknowledged the prophetic gifts of Montanus, Prisca, and Maximilla, and gave peace to the churches of Asia and Phrygia. But Praxeas, by misrepresenting the prophets, induced him to recall the letters of peace which he had issued, and to withdraw his recognition. Montanism had probably at one time many adherents in Italy, but it was in Africa that it won its most important conquest, Tertullian, who gave to its cause all the warmth of his African nature and the skill of a practised advocate. No other of the sects of the ancient Church has the advantage of presenting itself to later times as pictured by its greatest convert. A provincial council at Iconium, in the first half of the third century, declared Montanist baptism invalid, thus branding Montanism as a sect separate from the Church. Shortly afterwards Stephen, bishop of Rome, recognized it as valid. Nicaea passed the question over in silence. The synod of Laodicea, in the latter part of the third century, enacted that the Phrygians should be catechized and baptized ere they were admitted to the Church, and the Oecumenial Council of Constantinople even more strongly, that the Montanists, here called Phrygians, should be received into the Church in precisely the same manner in which pagans were received. Montanism was found worthy of notice even as late as the legislation of Justinian in the sixth century, and probably its later manifestations, when it was a mere despised sect, cast discredit on its earlier and purer time. But it was already practically extinct in the latter part of the fourth century, when, as Epiphanius tells us, it could point to no prophet. Its real work was done in the protest which it made against spiritual deadness in the Church in the second and third centuries. End of chapter 5, part 1.